thank you everybody for joining us today. It should be a pretty informative session. So, and can we go to the next slide? So we'll go through and cover several areas. First off, a little bit about Anglepoint and why we have the credibility to be talking to you about kind of SaaS and why it makes sense to kind of merge that in with your traditional ITAM programs. What some of the challenges are, some of our approaches and ideas and viewpoints on considerations that you should think through as you're building this in or building it out into your program, and how do you build a business case. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have ample time for Q&A. But along the way, certainly if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A session, not the chat session. So next slide, please. So I'll start by introducing myself. I see a lot of attendees that I've worked with over the years. I've been in this business for probably more years than I want to admit, but started way back in Y2K with technology. So sold ITAM tools for several years and been on the consulting side for the last 10 years. And I'm very passionate about helping clients knit together the best strategy to help them kind of identify risk, identify ways to mitigate it, and stretch that software dollar as far as they can. So I'll turn that over to Chris Hayes, who is another one of our speakers, for him to do a short intro.
Sure, thanks, Mari. My name is Chris Hayes. I am the manager of the SAM program design practice here at Anglepoint. I've been with Anglepoint just about 4 years. Prior to that, I have about 15 years industry experience as a practitioner. So what I'll be doing is kind of walking you all through SaaS management relative to kind of an ITAM or SAM based approach. That's kind of my role in this today. Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself too? Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. And hey, everyone, my name's Ryan Kruger. As we do these webinars, to me, it's always really humbling to be able to share in this type of format. And we're grateful that you're able to participate today. We really do hope to share some of the lessons learned, the observations that we've seen in both the ITAM and really just the SAM space in general. And we do recognize that there are lots of thought leaders and experts in this field, and many of which are on the call today. And we're grateful to be able to associate with you. All in all, we know that this past year has been one of growth and change. And Anglepoint over the last couple of years has decided to make a dedicated service offering that's really specific to SaaS license management. Since the beginning of this year, I've been leading that practice. And we do hope that as we go through the content today, that there's at least something that resonates with you that you can take back to your unique situation, your teams, your management, whatever that may be. We know that SaaS governance should be part of your overall ITAM strategy. And although it's unique in several ways, Chris Hayes will be sharing with us today a lot of the tried and true best practices that exist from a traditional SAM or ITAM space. And we really hope that you can then just apply the uniqueness of SaaS to your existing ITAM programs already. So that's a little bit about me. And then Mari, I'll hand it back over to you to talk about Anglepoint.
Great, thank you. So for those of you that don't know about Anglepoint, we're a full services ITAM consulting firm that really help our clients either create or improve on their ITAM program. Our goals are pretty simple, helping our clients identify risk, what they can do about it, and stretch that kind of software hardware dollar just as far as you can. And ultimately, in a perfect world, is we want to help our clients only license or buy the technology that they need and use to run their business. And all of that comes from really data-driven ITAM programs. And a lot of times we start with a point-in-time project. It could be something that is generated from a renewal, an audit, or just a assessment of your overall ITAM program. And then from there, we oftentimes expand from there. And each one, our managed services are very unique and customized to each client. So we really look at what you have, existing, what you want to keep in place, and augment that by some of our SMEs that we have here at Anglepoint. So we've been around for quite some time. We were founded in 2009 by several KPMG former auditors. They really got tired of being on the audit side versus the client side. So they decided to foundationally change that and created Anglepoint. We focus really entirely kind of on ITAM managed services, but as I mentioned, a lot of times we start with point in time. And it tends to, evolve from there. We are both tool and kind of reselling agnostic. So we have partnerships with all the leading tool providers, and we have those partnerships really to understand, where they can and can't collect and manage, and how the kind of people, process, and technology needs to be knit together to fill those gaps. As everybody on this call probably knows, there is no magic button with technology. And the tricky part is understanding, where you need to knit together those eyeballs and elbows to augment that. And that's where we have lots of experience on that. We're a global firm. We're up to somewhere about 200 consultants now. The majority of our people are in North America, but we are rapidly expanding in Europe as well. Where all of all of our consultants are Anglepoint employees, so we don't leverage any kind of offshoring or nearshoring. We're headquartered in Santa Clara, and it says 165 employees. Like I mentioned, this is updated. We're aggressively hiring. We have deep level experience with over 80 software publishers, so we understand how to interpret and analyze all of those 80 publishers to audit level accuracy. And focus a lot in the Fortune 500 space with over 82 of them actually Anglepoint, ongoing clients. We're a proud recipient of the Gartner SAM Managed Service Magic Quadrant. We're one of the leaders in that space. Gartner came out with this last year in 2020. It was, and as many of you know, Gartner doesn't come out with Magic Quadrants very often. They do that when they see a significant change in the industry, and we've definitely seen a move for clients to leverage managed service in some shape or size in their environment. Free up some of their resources to do things that are really strategic to the business. Licensing is incredibly tactical, but it's obviously very important. How do you get to that place where, again, you're only licensing what you need and use to run the business? So in 2020, you can see that we were upper right, 2021. We really kind of took off. So we really own this space, but we own this space not just because we're really good at what we do. Our clients also come back and tell us that, and this was very indicative of how Gartner evaluated the various participants in the Magic Quadrant. Not so much what we say in our approach and our methodology and our people, obviously, are important factors, but the biggest factor was what our clients said about us and how we were able to help them move the needle on their ITAM maturity and actually get the results that we're all looking to derive by putting the investment in the proper people, process, and technology. So we know that, that we're upper right, we're committed to continuing to evolve and make sure that we're continuing to drive that value to our clients. And as Ryan mentioned, one of our newest kind of practice areas is a focus just on what are the managed services that need to be created and offered to our clients specific to SaaS.
Great, thank you, Mari. I appreciate that. So what we're going to do next then is I want to dive. We're not going to go too deep in this because I think most of us on this in the audience today understand what the challenges are around SaaS management and incorporating that as part of your overall strategy. But if we look at the next slide here, part of our webinar sign-up form, there was an optional field that many of you filled out that essentially asked, what are some of your biggest pain points associated with SaaS in your various organizations? Listed here, we took those examples and put them on a single page here in terms of kind of the categories that we saw. I'm sure that these are very common and already known either by you or by your teams within your various organizations. But whether it be procurement management, vendor management, to IT leadership, product management, application owners, or the SAM managers themselves, or IT finance, it really does seem to be that these are the common observations that we see. If we look at number one, then, with the lack of visibility to data, man, that's a challenge, isn't it? We know that the trustworthy data is really key to any successful ITAM program, and that there are two major components to that trustworthiness. There's both the data completeness component as well as the data accuracy. So perhaps in many cases, it's kind of want to say air quotes here, it's easier, and I use those air quotes because it's often not the case, but let's imagine that in many cases, SaaS is easier to have the accurate data. There's still the issue of completeness and having all of it in your purview. Some of those questions, right? Do we know where the SaaS spend's coming from, where it's occurring? Do we have the proper people that have access to the reports, the portals, the outputs from data integrations, or the other administrative dashboards that exist that can in turn be used to assess complete data? Is our spend quantified, and is it known? At Anglepoint, and I probably said this before that many of you have probably heard, but we say that you really can't boil the ocean when it comes to managing your entire software estate within your organization, trying to do everything at once. So as such, performing a SaaS publisher prioritization exercise where we capture the spend and then normalize that to a specific SaaS provider or publisher will help immensely in understanding where your efforts should really focus and kind of taking that tiered approach, doing the biggest bang for your buck first. We're going to talk more about some of the tooling and solution considerations later, but it really is important that the data drive the solution, with the solution being more comprehensive and more holistic than just a single tool itself. And then for number two here with Shadow IT, we see that the proper detective controls can really help drive the uniformity of policy enforcement. Policies that put in place really do need to come from the top down with the proper executive level sponsorship that's really key to ensuring that policies enacted can actually then be enforced. And when we look at number three, the aligned strategy component, this is really a tricky one, as we see, and I'm sure that many of you have experienced, the strategies for SaaS is that, if there's even a strategy at all, is oftentimes at a business unit level or a team setting level versus enterprise-wide. We see oftentimes that there are fewer enterprise licensing agreements for a given SaaS provider, as the volume that's maybe purchased doesn't justify it, or it just hasn't gone through the appropriate IT purchasing channels. Or it can be perhaps that SaaS can oftentimes be quickly implemented, as it's simple as really just setting up an account or logging into a website, versus our traditional software request and deployment process for IT software. So we really do believe at Anglepoint in setting up an appropriate ITAM steering committee that is made up of cross-functional senior level stakeholders across the business that can then approve the policy and approve the strategy that your organization takes. Now, we could talk for a whole webinar about that single topic, so we're not going to dive too deep into it, but we do want to call it out here that it's important in having that authority to enact real change, and then making sure that the various organizational silos that exist all can align. For number four, then, with the business case to drive management support, it's really important that incorporating SaaS management into your overall ITAM strategy be supported by your senior management. Now, we're going to talk today about some of those steps that can be taken to build the business case, But as mentioned earlier, that data-driven approach of looking at spend, looking at your risk, your usage, and more will allow for that executive level buy-in to occur such that management does support the direction that you're trying to pursue. So with that in mind, then I'm going to turn the time over to Chris, who's going to give us a deeper perspective of how we can overcome some of these challenges that you may be encountering.
Thanks, Ryan. So, as we've been discussing, and as kind of the purpose here is to really look at managing your SaaS software estate, similar to how you would have controls, policies, technology, et cetera, in place for your IT asset management program. So, thinking about that, there are kind of four main areas that we're going to cover off in the subsequent slides: tooling, policies, processes, and controls. You should already be thinking about these along with your SAM and ITAM program, right? The assumption here is that you're working within the confines or within the structure already of an ITAM program. So, we're just going to apply those concepts to that SaaS estate. So in that aspect, we're thinking about a lot of the kind of continuity and similarities and leveraging that to really add value across this other kind of use case, shall we say. So on the right, we're talking about some of the value adds and some of the intrinsic kind of structures and frameworks and approaches that are already there, existent in an ITAM program. So in your ITAM program, you're going to be focused in thinking about tooling and integrations, APIs with multiple data sources. From that perspective, you can think about, linking to some of the SaaS portals, et cetera, to your existing ITAM repository or solution, just as quote unquote another integration. So that's kind of why we highlight that point. Ryan did talk about the holistic, trustworthy data aspect. That should be consistent throughout ITAM, right? Whether it's SaaS, whether it's cloud, whether it's on-prem, whether it's a hybrid, et cetera, you should always have that basis of being able to provide actionable intelligence to the business. And actionable means you can trust those recommendations and it's going to be a value add. So that is a hallmark of what we recommend in SaaS and otherwise. The renewals process, we'll talk a little bit more about processes in the subsequent slides. The renewals process should be a robust and mature process, again, focused not just on SaaS, but be more holistic. So the fact that, you've got an existing program, that's kind of the assumption going in here, that's something that you really want to zoom in on and kind of hang your hat on, are those mature processes that are able to support multiple use cases. So in this case, we're talking about SaaS. And then Ryan touched on the publisher prioritization as well. So that approach is very much what we advocate and what we recommend, so that you're not chasing around kind of onesie twosie publishers that you don't have a large spend or large risk with, and that you're really adding that value where it's going to make the most difference in your organization. You're really moving the needle maturity-wise. So the first two areas we're going to talk about are tooling and processes. So this is just kind of a mid-level walk through each of these topics. Again, each one of these areas in the quadrant we could have a whole webinar on. So we're just kind of hitting the major points just to kind of frame up the discussion and hopefully provide you all with a sustainable and go forward approach relative to how you can think about SaaS management. So some of the tooling considerations, we thought this would be kind of easy to present in kind of a tabular form to organize our thoughts a little bit. The first column is by way of calculation and analytics. So by that, we mean kind of what are the capabilities of the tooling or of the solution. To call out and to mention, we are very much, again, from that previous slide that Mario was walking through, tool agnostic, right? So that means what you'll have to do in your organization, we're not going to say, okay, tool 1 versus tool 2 is a lot better or a lot worse. What you're going to have to do and what you should do, what's recommended that you do, is take a very agnostic approach yourself and let the data drive your decision. It's not, okay, well, so-and-so has purchased this solution, so we need to use it. And then you're going backwards. Start with the data, and that should inform and drive your approach, not only in SaaS, but for your full program. So in the area of calculation and analytics, and when we say tooling, we're thinking about tooling as part of a larger solution, right? So think about that as kind of a puzzle piece. The tool might be an important puzzle piece, but it's not your full solution. You might have some manual effort, you might have some additional reporting, you might have some other processes and procedures that support that tool to create the full solution for how you manage in SaaS. So in calculation and analytics, this is talking specifically about that tooling, that portion of the solution, what it can do. Can your tool analyze named user input, login information, transaction information? So those of you who are familiar with SaaS know that there are nuances in those license metrics that could determine wild fluctuations in the output in terms of being compliant or not, and what you need to manage and what you need to monitor. So are those native to the tool? Does your tool support an automated reconciliation process? So can you go into your tool and say, I want to kick off a license balance or effective license position ELP every hour, every week, every month to have my reporting? Or is that a manual process? Do you have to refresh your data sources? So kind of considering how old is your data? What is the latest and greatest information getting in, again, to support that trustworthy, holistic approach that's going to inform your actionable recommendations to the business. So how manual versus how automated is that? Again, here, and these are very much open topics, right? So there's no right answer. If your tool is a little bit more manual, that's not to say it's bad. You need to make sure this is going to fit your use case in your organization. So just some considerations here. Last but not least, on the calculation analytics side, are you able to look at different user profiles or user departments or roles? So some license metrics and some SaaS publishers depend on varying profiles or varying departments or even roles of users to determine license consumption. So is that capability in your tool or not? Again, kind of taking that data point driven approach. Are you hitting the mark with your current tooling, or is there a potential gap? And again, we keep this kind of consideration level and a bit tool agnostic just to consider some of these concepts. The next is ease of integration. So if you have specific portals where you can access or easily aggregate some of this publisher information, is a native API or connection to that out of the box possible, or is there a lot of customization involved? Can you also integrate this tool or part of your solution with your existing purchasing system to get a full ELP or compliance type view? Can you not? Is there additional customization that has to happen there? Again, kind of open-ended questions. Are there workflow integrations? So for example, if you run an ELP and you determine that you're oversubscribed, are you able to, via an existing workflow tool or service management type tool, are you able to deprovision a user? Are you able to shut off a subscription? Are you able to, if you're way underutilizing your licenses and you want to optimize, can you kick off a deprovisioning job? Is there an integration that's possible to other parts of your service management estate or not? You know, is there a lot of development involved? So that's kind of the scale on each of these. Can it happen out of the box? Can it happen at all? Is there a lot of customization? A lot of these different topics are going to kind of fall somewhere in that spectrum. Is hybrid integration and identification possible? So if you've got a publisher that has, let's say, some on-premise portion, and maybe they operate some in the cloud, maybe they're a mix of SaaS and perpetual licensing, is that reflected and easily managed within your tool? Or is that just a mess? Or do you have multiple tools? Are you going to have one view with SaaS, one view with more traditional license management, and the overlaps or any potential gaps there? So, you know, thinking about, again, a solution might be made up of multiple tools. So you've got to consider those items. For reporting, is your reporting native, right? Is there a value add component? Because ideally you want to have as much as possible done in an automated and sustainable way using any kind of tool. Is the tooling capability, the reporting capability sufficient to swivel in hand to senior management? Is that something that they're going to understand and be able to take those actions, the recommendations coming from the program? Or is that something that you need to take to a Power BI type tool to have some rich reporting? Are there integrations that's possible? So if you have thinking about multiple tools, again, as part of your solution, and your existing ITAM tool or your ITAM repository is doing some fancy reporting via Power BI, Can you integrate in your SaaS data points also to Power BI? How difficult or how easy is that to consider? And is there capability within your tooling to look at some of the data sets and slice and dice them, having some additional segmentation? Could you run an effective license position for a business unit or for a cost center or for a country or for a cluster of buildings or whatever kind of organizational segmentation you would want to achieve? Or is that really difficult to do? So just some considerations again on the tooling side. It's not bad if you don't have this current capability, but more kind of food for thought. On the process side, we mentioned this before in that previous slide, walking through these kind of 4 areas. We're assuming that you have processes existent in your ITAM program. You should really look for process maturity, being able to accommodate multiple use cases. So if you have a process to request so-called regular standardized software, your managed catalog should expand to include SaaS, right? So you should have on-premise software, but also commonly used SaaS software. Your back-end request process, including provisioning, et cetera, should include standards of SaaS software, right? So you want to make sure that, for example, your software asset management or your IT asset management team has visibility, that you're able to forecast demand by speaking to the application owners of SaaS applications within your business. And potentially, if you're looking at some of this tooling in terms of reporting, in terms of usage and trending, you would think about that relationship. So very similar to how you would operate potentially in an ITAM program, with your ITAM team working with the finance department, working with procurement and sourcing, and working with those application owners to be proactive with your license management. By that, I mean procurement and sourcing would own the renewals and the purchasing cycle. They would come up with a requirement to say, okay, we've got a publisher and we have a new renewal coming in February, and it's a large one. So ITAM and SAM team, we need to have visibility on all this usage. And the ITAM and SAM team would follow up with that application owner to say, okay, renewal in February, let's confirm these numbers and provide it to procurement sourcing. That way you've got a value add, finance gets a consistent view, and you renew ahead of time, and you make sure you're optimizing those renewals with your key publishers. On the process side as well, it's important from a service management perspective, not only IT asset management perspective, that you have a robust and mature joiners, movers, leavers process. A lot of the license metrics and license consumption in SaaS are driven by subscription, and that's tied to, you see that upper left-hand corner in the calculation analytics, named users or logins, right? So these are tied to actual people or accounts. So it's important that you leverage your HR information and identity access management information and work closely with those teams to make sure you have an aligned and very clean view on that data. You can also flip-flop and utilize a lot of your trustworthy data from IT asset management to ensure that they've got a clean view. It's recommended that if you have a solution here, you've got a tool that's able to integrate that management capability via directory management solutions. So single sign-on, et cetera, to ensure that you're driving that automation and you've got a view that's based in reality and a reality of very trustworthy data across kind of the HR and identity access management spectrum. The other couple areas of the quadrant we're going to cover off on this slide. So we're talking about policies and controls. Policy categories are a little bit more preventative. So when you think about, I'm going to hop around here for a second. When you think about preventative versus detective control, typically, just because of the nature of how SaaS is potentially spun up in the organization, and you've got a little bit more difficulty getting a handle on the visibility initially, we talk about being a little bit more preventative in SAM, right? Because you can technically limit if people want to install software on their machine, you can lock that down with administrative rights, et cetera. Whereas the distributed and easy to access nature of SaaS makes it a little bit more reliant on detective control. So in the policy categories, typically these are viewed as preventative controls, right? You want to drive end user behavior and correct behavior to ensure that you're not creating a larger issue, right? That people are following along and doing the correct things to make sure they're not creating additional incompliance, et cetera. Number one here in SaaS is very much from a security and infrastructure review type perspective, that there should be some statements in your information security and infrastructure usage policies that say unauthorized SaaS instances should not be allowed, right? Policy should also always contain some information about enforcement. So, it should share with an agreed end audience. Okay, we're going to contextualize this and say what you need to do and what you need to not do. But if there is what you need not to do, there should also be a consequence, right? And that comes with policy enforcement. We mentioned in one of the previous slides about the ITAM steering committee. Their mandate and support is critical here, because if you've got a policy that says you really should not spin up any unauthorized SaaS, and someone says, yep, I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then they get caught, if it's not being enforced and those consequences are not brought to bear, then the next person who gets wind of this, oh, so-and-so had an unauthorized SaaS instance and that was okay, then that's going to proliferate, right? So we want a very even-handed application all through the business, a uniform application of policy. So all of these policies should have a consequence, right? If you spin up an unauthorized SaaS instance, then you're going to have a talk with information security. If it's really bad, you might have a discussion with HR, right? There should be some consequence in here. But that's the first one that we would recommend, is that your information security policy and infrastructure policy say they should at least, those two teams, be involved in review when there is SaaS that is spun up. So this is kind of the preventative measure of control. In terms of spinning these up and funding SaaS instances, there should be something in your corporate purchasing policy to say, when you as an end user decide to spin up a SaaS instance and not follow the regular sourcing process, so that's kind of those subsequent couple policy categories we'll cover off, it should have a statement to the effect that you will not be reimbursed and that you are not allowed to purchase instances on a corporate card without express written permission as an exception. What you want to do as much as possible is drive via a centralized and centrally managed request and renewal process so that's supported by procurement and sourcing, and you've got that spend visibility. If there are instances that for whatever reason must go outside of that process, then those end users, those actors, need to be granted an exception. It is management by exception that you want to strive for. So if you have to go outside of that process, should be few and far between. And to be honest, you should have some language in your sourcing procurement policy that says, if you are found to have spent money on a SaaS instance, it's not going to be reimbursed, right? And again, some enforcement and consequences here. One of the ways, just as an aside, to get some good visibility on some of your spend, and especially if you're kind of doing this for the first time and just kind of you have a greenfield approach saying, right, we need to get a handle on this, is look through purchasing information. That's a very rich area where you can drill back and say, okay, we may not have visibility to whatever the marketing department's doing or whatever the events department or some other department is doing, and it's just internet traffic, so it's hard to tackle. But we see these weird purchases, or we see these non-approved purchases, or we see a whole bunch of purchases on a P card or procurement card that we can then go chase down. And you've got an individual to ask and say, okay, what is this spend? It looks like SaaS spend. Then you can start doing your consumption visibility and tie those ends together. But in terms of policy, very much you want to drive behavior to go via a centralized request channel as much as possible. And that's that last one. You should do as much as possible to support those central purchasing channels. So the policy language should essentially say kind of what I alluded to. You have a standard request process. If there is an exception in the area of SaaS, then you need to have an approval before you go ahead and execute those purchases. On the control side, I touched on this at first, that SAM is a little bit more preventative versus SaaS being a little bit more detective, in that if you have a determined person in marketing with a P card, right, they're going to spin up a Salesforce instance, faster than you can snap. It's hard to prevent technically a lot of those things. There are some ways, but it's a lot easier to kind of go through and say, okay, we're going to find instances of shadow SaaS where people are not following the correct processes and go after them and remediate those. One of the recommendations, though, to that end is to have a very proactive and good working relationship with a lot of these publisher account teams, right? So the Smartsheets or Datadogs or SailPoints of the world, you can go out and say, okay, we need to have some value add type reporting. We need to have a centralized purchasing channel. So for instance, if you're working with Smartsheet and Smartsheet says, right, we can develop for you some reporting that gives you visibility to all of your spend. So maybe not even via your central channels, but a report directly from Smartsheet, from this publisher that would say, okay, so-and-so in marketing department who wasn't approved, or we don't know if they're approved, they tried to send us a purchase order. And they're not our key contact. So we're going to proactively reach out to you, procurement and sourcing or IT asset management team. And then that way you can proactively head off some of that spend and say, okay, marketing department, what's going on? That was a non-approved purchase, or that purchase went via a non-central channel. If you're working proactively with these publisher teams, they can also help you to gain visibility into co-term agreements. So we worked with a client who had a few SaaS tools in place. One of the comments on the call with an application owner was, wow, okay, I had no idea. We have another department who's utilizing this exact same tool with a little bit different feature set, and they had 2 different agreements. So even internally in the business, there were silos, right? So if you're working proactively with some of these account teams on the publisher side, they would be able to give you visibility and say, okay, did you know you've got 4 other agreements with us, these other 3 departments? So let's work to co-term these. Make sure they renew on the exact same date. That way, your renewals process, your optimization and risk mitigation processes are a lot easier. Be proactive. And the last one cannot be stressed enough. Don't hesitate to push for value add services. You want to have a productive long-term relationship with all of your publishers. Again, and these are kind of a little bit generic to ITAM and SAM as well as SaaS. You should be doing this across the board, but especially in SaaS, this really helps. If you say, look, we'd love to have some proactive reporting. We'd love to know when someone from marketing emails you and it wasn't authorized. Please come back to us proactively, right? So those are some value add things you can ask and don't hesitate to ask from your publishers. So I'm going to throw it back to Ryan to just give some information and a couple examples about some of these concepts as they've been applied with some of our clients and some of the success that we've had as a result. So there you go, Ryan.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate what you've said so far. This list, as you can see, disclaimer, right? It's not meant to be entirely exhaustive, but just within the last several months, and in looking at us, really maturing and building our AnglePoint service offering. I put here 4 different areas where we've seen a lot of growth and a lot of room in terms of where our customers were and where they came to, or where they are and where they're going, really. So the first one here, we don't have time to dive super deep into each, but with respect to the negotiating favorable terms and conditions, just taking the first example, and I know I don't want to be too publisher specific here because these are wins and successes that we see broadly across a whole host of SaaS publishers, but Salesforce is a big one, right? Chris Hayes alluded to that there is Salesforce purchasing can be going all throughout the business without it known from one business unit to another. And as we see, especially as we kind of move from the mid-size to the larger tier of Salesforce customer, where they have a Salesforce enterprise licensing agreement in place. License transfers allow a company to transfer their Salesforce licenses from one org or instance to another, where the org that is providing the licenses has the surplus, and the org receiving the licenses has a need for them. It's a way to right-size the expensive investment made while a customer is mid-agreement without having to purchase net new licenses. And, just something as simple, and I should say simple, but it's really, not necessarily simple, but ensuring that those kinds of terms and conditions are negotiated into a contract is important, while ensuring also that any strategically important product to the business has that license transfer right granted or assigned to it. I really truly believe that the SAM or ITAM function within the business brings those cross-functional stakeholders into play in order to be able to execute those types of transfers, right? We've seen millions of dollars of cost avoidance realized by our customers because they've been wise stewards of the Salesforce estate and they've had that visibility, which brings me to the point of visibility. Really to no fault of any one person, time and time again, when we've been brought in to assist in a publisher specific SaaS licensing exercise, or perhaps a licensing needs assessment, we see that the organizational silos that exist in managing the specific publisher's licenses. From what was brought into what's in use, little really is known. Having that SAM function bring together those various roles, as we've already mentioned about what some of those roles are, and begin the conversations around usage are so valuable. In my opinion, I just want to give allude to a couple of the questions that could be asked, but really, in my opinion, it's a lot of the simple questions, right? Maybe it's a loaded answer, but the question to ask is relatively simple. It could be that, hey, is your business unit or team using this application? And if so, how are you managing it, if at all? It could be, how long have you been using it? What are your plans for future use? Where and how do you procure it? Or how do you provision the software to end users? Just beginning to prime the pump by asking those kinds of questions is really important. In my opinion, asking questions at all is way more important than asking the right questions. That as the conversations begin to develop and the information's brought to light, we'll break down those barriers and help the enterprise on an enterprise-wide level have the visibility. Going then now to the bottom left of maintaining trustworthy data. Well, we've already talked about data trustworthiness as being huge and incredibly important to SaaS management. We see I'm just going to give a call out to that SAM or ITAM function, but really we do see that SAM or ITAM function as the translator or the interpreter of so much of the data that is in the various SaaS portals or the consoles or the administrative dashboards. So supporting the functions of managing those user accounts of the levers, for example, as Chris Hayes called out, is of particular importance. Beyond just we want to make sure that the customer, you as a SaaS customer are not overpaying for something, as well as mitigating any potential security risks by making sure that systems access has been removed for those who have since left the company. We also see from just the idea of optimizing spend, putting the dollars where they're actually needed, or perhaps in many cases, actually decreasing your contract value or amount, harnessing the power of looking at the data beyond just which users have been provisioned to a certain type of license. Where do those users sit? Are there tax considerations that could bring your organization's overall tax burden down? Do we know not only which users have logged in, but what features they've used or what applications they're accessing? We do see that with respect to the maturity of reporting that Chris Hayes had kind of talked about, whether it be a native reporting capability or whether it be from some third party or a tool, it really is very different depending on the specific SaaS publisher. But having, especially for those exceptionally strategic or SaaS publishers where your spend volume is high or it's incredibly important to the business, diving deeper and figuring out what data is available and how can we get that data is incredibly important. We see that oftentimes for SaaS kind of consumption data, it's incredibly feature rich oftentimes, which can provide you as a person that's invested in managing the software estate wisely in your organization, the respective insights that you can then take back to the teams and say, hey, let's put licenses in this place instead of this place, or let's give this team a specific feature. We can give them that feature without purchasing anything net new, right? Again, just a couple smattering of examples of the conversations that could be had by really diving deep into what kind of data is available from a reporting layer. So, all in all, there's incredible room for opportunity. There's incredible room to optimize, to have that negotiating power for the customer when you're at the negotiating table with the SaaS publisher, and having consistent, uniform, repeatable data over time. Really key here. So with that in mind, then I'm going to hand it back to our friend Chris. And Chris, I believe you're going to talk about some of the immediate next steps that can be had, or building the business case rather within your organization for managing SaaS.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And I note we're already getting some Q&A in, so I will go a little bit quickly through these next couple sections so we can get to some good questions and answers. That Taylor, that looks like a really interesting question already, so absolutely we'll address that. But yeah, we're going to talk right now about developing a business case, right? That was one of the concepts in this webinar as well, that fine and good, but what do I, as an ITAM manager or SAM manager or member of the department or manager of the entire program, how do I approach this, right? What pieces do I need to put together so that I can help construct a business case for saying, this is important in the organization, it deserves some attention, if not some investment resources. First, define your problem. We're taking a very logical and data-driven approach, as you'll see through these subsequent boxes here. But the first thing that you want to do is look at your publisher spend and risk data. You do not want to go spinning your wheels and chasing something that ultimately ends up being kind of a wild goose chase, or something that's not going to add value, or even worse, be misaligned with your organization's priorities, right? So really look at all of the spend information. I would recommend you look at raw procurement information as opposed to looking at just kind of onesie twosie reseller reports. You should look at it all, but I think you should start with your kind of centralized procurement sources of information, or your ERP systems, as much as possible, and then kind of add on and bolt on reseller reports as needed. Also consider your risk, right? So do some research, look at BSA, SIA, FAST, any kind of the compliance organizations. See which of your top publishers where you have a lot of spend are members of those organizations and are interested in compliance. We'll kind of say it that way, to where you have your risk, right? And then kind of look at your the kind of depth of the problem. And that's kind of what we talk about here. Based on your priorities, determine your focus. If your priority for your program is, right, we are interested in risk mitigation, and how is everything supporting risk mitigation? And info security, they're supporting risk mitigation this way, and this other big initiative is supporting risk mitigation this way. If you turn up to the organization and say, well, we're doing cost control, you need to have that aligned, right? So Taylor, that's going to go a little bit in the direction of your question. We'll get to that in a second, but you want to make sure that you are adding value according to what is defined as valuable for your organization. So if your organization says cost control, well, how are you going to support cost control, right? Your largest spend, how do you make that the smallest? How do you optimize your estate? If it's risk mitigation, then the riskiest publishers you should tackle first, right? Determine what focus out of those SaaS publishers will be based on the priorities of your organization that drive your ITAM program. Do a gap analysis. So based on that defined and sized problem, let's say you've got five top publishers you're going to look at. What are your current capabilities, and what are those requirements from the publisher? Do you have to go after transactional level data? Do you have to go after number of terabytes being backed up and something else? What kind of data points and what kind of measurement capabilities are there versus what needs to be there? So do that gap analysis. Then define your end state, right? This all kind of fits in, because you're saying, okay, we have priorities, we have a problem, and we've got a gap analysis. Well, where do we want to end up? Do we want it to be a little bit simpler? Do we want it to be fully automated, integrated, end-to-end, fancy reporting XYZ? Use that gap analysis and feed that in, and make sure you're including this in your ITAM roadmap, right? SaaS is going to be a subset of how you're handling the larger software estate. Help build out that business case, right, based on what your roadmap looks like, and that should be driven by your priorities. Define your ask. You should have an executive sponsor for your program. Should not be just a team of people with no linkage to senior management. Whoever your executive sponsor or manager or manager's manager is, you should leverage that person to help communicate that business case. Again, defined, sized, data-driven. You've done your homework, you've done your gap analysis, you've defined where you want to end up. It's all aligned with your program. Make sure they support communicating that, and then demonstrate that value. Assuming you can get the resources, this is then the flip side. They're going to spend and outlay some resource, maybe give you an extra person, spend some money on a tool, use your existing KPIs in your program to say, look, in the area of SaaS, here's what we're doing, and then communicate widely. Make sure you share your success and say, here's what we are doing. So there's a brief on some next steps, and then we will get to Q&As because we're kind of rapidly running out of time here. So again, great, well and good, but what now? Where do we start? How do we really get our arms around this, right? Even outside of doing the business case to make sure this is something that you can focus resource-wise on in your organization. What do I do as an ITAM manager, as a SAM manager? Number one, it should always start with data, trustworthy data. That's going to drive your actionable recommendations to the business. That's what you want to do. We talked about purchasing data. So look at your ERP systems with procurement and sourcing, look at some reseller reports, get as complete as possible a view on what you're purchasing. And then look at installation and usage, right? Look at your ITAM repository, look at some of the publisher portals, think about what gaps in solution you have, but you need to understand from both pillars what your data is and what you know, kind of the known unknown, right? If you have a gap, that's okay, but you need to be able to triangulate that and say, okay, I know we have a gap in capability. We're zooming in and focusing here. So make sure you nail your trustworthy data, number one. That will also drive a lot of those other activities, namely looking at publisher prioritization, kind of aligning your approach, et cetera. Then number two, think about your existing estate. If you have conformant SaaS, how do you approach that? How do you optimize that? How do you mitigate? How do you get ahead of some of those renewals? Sorry, I'm going really rapid fire, but I'm kind of throwing out some of the things that you'll need to be doing. And then on the shadow SaaS side, you will, it's more of a when rather than if, you will run into instances that are unauthorized. And then how do you rationalize those, right? You need to apply your policy and say, this is not allowed. You are not going to be reimbursed for your renewal. And you need to go back through the review process to make sure that this is not a security risk for the organization. Or if this is really bad, you know, there needs to be some kind of enforcement mechanism that is triggered and enforced in a uniform way. And then thinking about developing a governance framework. What will your operating model be, driven by your policies and your processes? Who is allowed to spin up SaaS? Who has visibility to this? Who helps manage that life cycle of those instances? And then that is underpinned by that steering committee. They are going to approve the model, approve the framework, very similar to how you operate with other areas of software, but in as much as they're managing and supporting the management of the ITAM program, that steering committee is going to be very valuable. So I will change it to this, but then I think we can go to some Q&A because I see one already in terms of the steering committee. So Taylor, I'll address that question. The question says, could you please provide some context of what SAM steering committee charter could potentially look like? And saying that you know, that's not something that they're necessarily doing right now in the organization. So a SAM steering committee as such is really a cross-functional body of leaders in an organization. The concept is they need to be empowered to make decisions and be able to allocate resources kind of regardless of whatever happens technology-wise. So typically you would have some people from service management, maybe from procurement sourcing. Sometimes there would be people from info security, infrastructure management, service desk. So very much cross-functional within the business. And you know, the charter is going to be how you define the approach and the success of your IT asset management program. So the first thing that you want to do is understand, you know, kind of the reason or raison d'être, reason for being of your program. What are we wanting to accomplish? And how are we planning on accomplishing that, right? What is that value that's going to be added by the program? define that, and then define what success looks like, right? So is it cost savings? Is it risk mitigation? What is the organization going to value? And then the steering committee as such, so I know we have some other questions and I'll be quiet here, but a steering committee as such, it is going to receive a lot of information, right? Those reports and a demonstration of, okay, we've agreed that saving cost is valuable. Here's how we're saving cost, and here are these reports. So the steering committee charter is going to be different from organization to organization. You need to define first why you are doing IT asset management, why it's important. And then second, what the goals are for that, so you can all align. And then the steering committee should meet once a quarter to receive those reports. So I know we have another question. I'll give that to Ryan to walk through. Sorry, we have a few, so we'll just kind of get back-to-back questions. So Ryan, go ahead.
Perfect. And as I know we only have a couple minutes left, but if any of you have additional questions that we can't answer, feel free to reach out to us via on LinkedIn or other channels. But the question we have here is, do you, Anglepoint, have preference for any SaaS management or visibility tools? The answer, this person provided various examples. So the short answer is, as we mentioned, is that we are tool agnostic, but each one of the SaaS management platform or SMP tools has strengths, right, to them. Just listing off some names, this is by no means meant to be exhaustive, but there's tooling providers for SaaS like Xylo, LeanIX, Productive, and then there's also Snow, ServiceNow, Flexera, and the traditional ITAM tools are constantly evolving and upgrading their capabilities for SaaS license management specifically. What we recommend, based off what Chris Hayes as well said, is that you take what you need, you build the business case, you look at the problems that you're trying to solve, and then look at the capabilities of the various tooling providers and figure out what's going to work best for your organization. I think a lot of the reporting and insights there, week to week, it seems that they're improving and changing their capabilities from a tooling perspective for these SMPs. So I happy to take that offline with the person that asked on that, and we can discuss more. But yeah, it's an exciting space to be, because a lot of the evolution of kind of our traditional ITAM tools, we're seeing the SaaS space slowly catching up, right? It's catching up to provide those insights and give you as the customer the ability you need to have the data you need when you need it.
One thing I will just pin on to the end of that answer then, Ryan, you do not ever want to be in a position, regular SAM or SaaS wise, where you say, okay, we've purchased Xylo and we need to find all this transaction data. Well, how do we build a process that accommodates this? Then it's kind of tail wagging the dog, right? You always want to go from your data and requirements, and then tooling should be that last discussion, as opposed to, we need to manage SaaS, we've just bought something, now how do we make it work, right? Then you're going to be in a world of hurt. So very much go based on the data and requirements first. Did we have any other Q&A? I think those were the couple that we've answered. So Braden, I think I will throw this back to you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks for presenting, and thanks to everyone for attending. Well, this was great stuff, and we're excited to get this recording out, and we'll share that with you tomorrow. And then again, like Chris mentioned, and Ryan, if you have any other questions or anything else that we can help you with, please feel free to reach out. You can go to our website, anglepoint.com/schedule. You can email us at info@anglepoint.com, or you can reach out to Chris, Mari, or Ryan through LinkedIn if you'd like. But again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you, everyone.